Hi, my name's Jay Kemp. I'm a director of photography with Story Keep here in Toronto. What's a director of photography? It's a fancy cameraman. We have the opportunity to tell people's stories, and for us to go in, it's part of my job to capture the essence of the character, the environment, the emotion. And oftentimes we do multiple day shoots. The one we did here in Toronto was a 1 day shoot. So there's a little bit of nervousness on the part of the crew and part of the husband and wife that we did a story on coming in. Within minutes, we were very comfortable with each other. We walked them through the process of, setting up the camera, setting up the interview, letting them see the shot. And during this 1 day shoot, they were very comfortable. We had family members looking at the monitor. We were playing back clips. It was a wonderful experience, not just for the husband and wife and their extended family, but for us as a crew. We really felt like we were part of the process. I think everyone has a story to tell. And if this is something you think you or a family you work for might be interested in, then please reach out to StoryKeep, because we would love to have the opportunity to help tell your story.
Welcome to Who We Remember. I'm Jamie Younger, the founder of StoryKeep and your host for this podcast. It is so wonderful to have you here joining us for this show. This is a place where we have uncommon conversations about things that matter deeply, the people we love, and the purpose that we give to our own lives and legacies. Our mission at StoryKeep is to capitalize on the power of story for profound good in families of wealth. Since 2010, we've partnered with over 100 families worldwide, creating personal films and private podcasts that celebrate a family's shared narrative. Our work is designed to deepen connections. My conversations on this show center around two questions. The first is, whose life story from your own family would you most want to see documented? And the second question is, what are you, as a person and as a professional, hoping to create and leave behind? Today, I'm honored to welcome Deborah Goldstein. Deborah is the founder of Enlightened Philanthropy. Drawing from more than 25 years of experience in the nonprofit field, she supports clients on their philanthropic journeys so they can give with confidence and make an impact. Goldstein particularly enjoys helping families give collaboratively and experience meaningful moments together as the next generation engages in this process. She is also the creator of Philanthropy Camp for Women, an opportunity for women to explore their giving and learn in community. I'll add that Deborah is the co-dean of philanthropy for the Purposeful Planning Institute. Today, Deborah is speaking about her dad, Gersham Goldstein. Gersham was a prominent Portland, Oregon tax lawyer. He was also an active member of the Jewish community. Originally from Brooklyn, New York, he drove to Oregon in 1963 to work for Oregon Supreme Court Justice Alfred T. Goodwin. Over his early career, he worked for Governor Mark Hatfield, Jacob Javits, and taught at NYU and the University of Cincinnati. In 1975, he and his wife Pauline returned to Portland, where he took a position at Davies Biggs. His work and his personality seem to have made a big impression on Deborah. As a kid, Deborah loved to read books. She often saw her dad reading or editing. Their home was filled with books, so it's just, become a part of who she is today. And I'm very delighted to enjoy this intimate conversation with her as we explore the enduring influence of her dad and the legacy that she is building for herself. So, Deborah, it's lovely to sit down with you and have this opportunity to talk about your dad. So thanks for joining me for this conversation.
It's my pleasure. Always happy to talk about my dad.
Yeah. Well, I am really delighted to say that in the course of our time together here, the viewers, the listeners will be able to hear your dad's voice because you shared some recordings of him. One was he was sort of like performing a beautiful kind of lecture, a casual lecture in front of an audience, which we won't hear because the audio was a little low, but we will hear something taken from an oral history recording that was made for the Oregon Jewish Museum. So that's coming. But first, I want to hear when I asked you, whose life story from your own family would you want to have documented? You said your dad. So tell me about your dad, who he was, and why you would pick him for this.
Well, I immediately thought of my dad, Gersham Goldstein, because I've always been fascinated by his life story and the stories that he told about his life. And I really wanted him to write the stories. And now I'm kind of realizing by going back to these recordings that that may have been the best way to have captured him and his stories were in his own voice. And I'm sorry that we didn't get a chance to do more of that. I'm glad we do have the pieces that we do have that you referred to. And so my dad is from Brooklyn, New York. He was born in 1938 in Brooklyn. He was the oldest of two brothers of my grandparents. And he basically grew up in Brooklyn. He was always fond of talking about, he went to PS 206 and he went to this junior high and, he played stickball and,
for those people who maybe aren't familiar with stickball in New York, can you give an adequate description or shall I?
Oh, I can't.
Okay, well, I did live in New York for 13 years, so I'll try my best. I never played stickball myself, but it's worth saying because it's kind of a classic New York City game, which is basically you're playing in the middle of a street. Traffic can come at any moment. You find a stick. It's not necessarily a baseball bat of any kind of official quality. And I think it's usually flatter. And then you're kind of playing baseball in a sense, but you're using the stoops and the curbs, in probably very imaginative ways to follow the rules that particular block of kids had come up with. So that I think is maybe an adequate description of stickball.
Thank you. You do that much more colorfully than I would have. But that's what I always have envisioned, was like kids playing in the middle of the street, but it's a very different street in a city versus in a suburb, right?
Oh, yeah. Somebody is always going, car.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then he went to James Madison High School, which he was very proud of. There are numerous alum that came out of that high school, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, two sitting senators right now. Names I actually looked this up because it's kind of fun. I mean, people like Carole King, Judge Judy, Martin Landau. Like this is a school in high school that a school in Brooklyn that really produces some amazing people that have come out of there.
Yeah, well, let me stop you there because I think this is the perfect moment to share this, 30-second excerpt from this interview with your dad. So, and I think this points to this fascinating thing about life journeys, which is that the influences that come on our path and shift and change and inspire us to take certain roads are sometimes so random. And I feel like your dad talks about this. He speaks about going to James Madison High School and how he got to school in the mornings and who was on his path there. So let me play this because I also love just hearing your dad's voice. There are some explicit content here, but I think our mature audience can handle it. So here's your dad, Gersham Goldstein.
I went to James Madison High School in Brooklyn. We didn't have any lawyers in my family. There was one, but really wasn't connected with that person. But I went, when I was going to James Madison, I would hitchhike up Bedford Avenue to James Madison. And many days, the person who picked me up was a gentleman by the name of Aaron Kuda, Koota. And Aaron Kuda was the district attorney of Kings County, Brooklyn, a city of 2.5 million people.
Sure.
And Aaron Kuda wore a Chesterfield coat and had a bowler hat. And since he lived sort of near where we lived, sometimes he had detectives sitting in front of his house when some son of a bitch had threatened his life. But he picked me up, and we would talk, and I always wanted to get a Chesterfield coat and a bowler hat. I did get a Chesterfield coat. I've never gotten a bowler hat.
So he says he hitchhiked up Bedford Ave, and that, I guess these early conversations with the district attorney had some bearing on him deciding to go into law later.
Yeah. And I had completely forgotten that until I started to listen to these recordings again. And it makes me, I'm sure at some point in my life, I asked my dad why law and why tax law in particular. But I think I asked them at a period of time in my life where I wasn't really taking it in.
Yeah.
So it would have been nice to have, kept asking that question at different periods in my life to see how he answered it and how I then really took that in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's funny, that my dad he sort of has this way of minimizing things a little bit in his life. Like, I did this because I wanted to wear the clothes of this persona, right?
The bowler hat.
Right. Or I did this because there was, and he talks about this when he gets to college. Like, I did this because there was no application, just like it sounds like he's taking the easy route through life. And yet, I think there's more to it than what he lets on.
Yeah. Isn't that so interesting? I think that it also comes down to the type of interviewer and interview experience of how much you can kind of nudge someone there, right? Because part of that is who your dad is, right? Diminishing and joking. And, as you said, he kind of likes to, earlier we were talking and you said he kind of likes to hold court, and there's some playfulness on that. And yet at the same time, you think, okay, this isn't just, hopscotching around. Like you did make choices, Dad, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about that, because I think you had shared earlier that one of the stories that you would love to have him, talk about and have recorded is how he flunked out of college. So, it does seem that, he became a prominent tax attorney in Oregon, in Portland, Oregon, but by all accounts, it seems like, from his telling, he almost didn't get there. So tell us about that and what you know of him flunking out.
Yeah. So this was a story that was often told in our family. And I think for me, it really helped to normalize that it's okay to fail at something. And so there was an appreciation for hearing this story over and over again. My dad graduated from high school early. I think he was like maybe 16 when he graduated from high school.
Now.
And he went to the City College of New York, which, as he said, had no application. Like, you graduated from high school and you could go to CCNY. And yet he flunked out his freshman year. And he was, by some miracle, let back in. I'm sure he did some finagling to make that happen. And the like guidance counselor that he had there said to him, Goldstein, if you want to upset your parents, just go eat a ham sandwich. Don't get me involved.
So, like, knowing that he's a Jewish kid, like,
yes, knowing that he's a Jewish kid and that, they kept kosher in their home and that would be a big deal to eat a ham sandwich, right? And that would be enough to upset my grandma and grandpa, his parents, right? Like, you don't need to go to the lengths of flunking out of school.
Right.
And so there was always, this humor to the story, even when something doesn't go quite right, there's humor there. There's some humor to it.
And when you think back about your dad, he had this lightness and this humor. Did he also have kind of a sense of being able to be sincere and sort of have an emotional truth when he was telling things as well? What do you remember of that?
Yeah, I mean, my dad kind of told things like they were, like you heard it in the recording, like he's just saying who these people are that are threatening this attorney, right? Like he didn't really mince words. And I appreciated that about him. Like there was an honesty to him, an integrity. He was always a very ethical person. And those are, qualities that just sort of came through over time through this variety of stories. And he always knew like what would fit the mood, right? Like there was that lightness, but he knew like when he needed to be sincere, he was sincere, right?
Yeah. So one of the things that is really, incredible about your dad and his journey is that he really went from being an East Coast, New York City, Brooklyn kid out to Oregon in, I think, 1963 or thereabout.
Yeah.
So what do you sort of know of his decision to make that big move? And then maybe he went back and forth a few times, but he ultimately stayed in Oregon. Yes. That's where you grew up, presumably.
Yes. So from CCNY, he went to Penn for law school and then to NYU to get his master's in taxation. And while at NYU, he was standing in the hallway one day looking at his grades, and they never put it up by name. They had numbers associated, and he's looking, and he's at the top of the list, and he's talking to a gentleman next to him, and the gentleman says, asks him like, "What are you doing this summer? What work do you have lined up?" And Dad's like, "I don't have anything." And he's like, "How are your grades?" And he's like, "Oh, I'm doing pretty well." And the gentleman says, "I'm going to introduce you to," I think it's his brother-in-law in Oregon. And my dad says, why do I need to go to Oregon? Like, I can get a job anywhere. Why am I going to go all the way to Oregon?
3,000 miles away.
And as he always liked to say, like at that point, he'd never been west of Bucks County, PA, which when you look it up on a map is not very much further west of New York City.
For all intents and purposes, it's New York City.
Exactly. And so the gentleman said, no, really, come over, have coffee with my wife, and we'll talk to you. So he met with them, had a great conversation. 3 days later, the gentleman is calling him and saying, "We're setting up a tax court in Oregon. Why don't you come clerk for the judge?" And so Dad spent that summer clerking with the judge. And he went to, I didn't know this for the longest time, but through that work, he went to every county in Oregon. So he's seen more of Oregon than I've ever seen still in my lifetime, and really had a great experience. And that summer also met my mother. They were living in the same apartment complex. And so, love stepped in there.
Yeah, and he didn't go back to New York, I guess. Or did he go back?
He went back. He finished with studies. And he and my mom sort of, figured things out. And his first job out of law school was as a law professor at University of Cincinnati Law School in Ohio. And my mom and dad got married and headed there to Ohio, where they lived for 11 years, where I was actually born. My brother and I were born there. And then I think I was around 4 when we moved to Oregon. And as my dad used to say, he said, I was making too much money, and so I decided to move to Oregon. So, and he landed here with a law firm where he stayed, and he started their tax department and was there until his retirement.
So your dad ended up becoming a prominent tax attorney in Oregon, in Portland. Apart from his career, what are the things that if you had the, know-how and the opportunity to sit and record his life story or have, a firm like StoryKeep do that, what would you want to ask now? What other relationships or parts of his life stand out as important at this point to you?
Well, one of them I mentioned earlier about asking about how he ended up in law. And I think the other piece of my dad's story that I also share is he had a younger brother who was sick in his childhood and then died at a young age. He was married, he had children, and he died from a rare form of cancer. And my brother was also sick when he was young. He was a diabetic, as was my father later in life. And then my brother died unexpectedly at 46. And I think I could have talked to my dad more about what that was like for him to lose his brother. But it didn't occur to me to ask that until he was already in his own grief over his son. And so that may have colored his perspective. I don't know. And so I just wonder about that. Like, what was that like for him to be the sole living son of his parents?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's where I am, my father died in 2020. My mom is still alive, but I'm sure as he had imagined that I would be growing old with this brother in my life. And I would have loved to have known more about their relationship.
Yeah. What did strike me, thank you for sharing that, about some of the things that you did choose to talk about with your dad. And I was impressed that you did do some kind of going down memory lane with your dad. Maybe you didn't talk about those things, but if I'm not wrong, you went back to Brooklyn with him and you kind of went on like a tour of his childhood.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about what inspired that and sort of where you went and what you were trying to capture at that moment.
I think, again, it comes back to that. I had probably been there when I was younger, but didn't hold that memory for myself. And I was going there for a training. This was probably about 10, 11 years ago now. And I said, hey, Dad, why don't you meet me? And you can take a trip down memory lane. His walking was not so great anymore. He was walking with a cane at that point. And I I don't know, something just called me. I don't remember exactly what it was, but something called me to take that opportunity and say, let's do this together. And so, we spent some time, in the village, and he showed me around there, around NYU, where I had spent some time with him. He had been a guest professor again in 91, my freshman year of college. And so I'd spent some time with him there at that time. But this was decades later at this point, right? And so to sort of hear these stories again and see where he played stickball, right? And see where these houses were and what they looked like, and see James Madison High School, and try to picture my dad there. And again, I think there's just so many questions that could have been asked, but there was just this desire to really connect with my dad in that way. And I've been very appreciative of the times that we've had one-on-one to just talk.
Yeah. When I hear you talk about your dad and the fact that you went down memory lane with him and did recordings, and I'm curious if there is a through line in your mind, maybe it's not very clear to the outside world, but a through line in your mind between who your dad was and what he did for his work, and now your focus in your career, where you work with individuals and families, helping them sort of align their values with their philanthropic endeavors and giving choices. And do you see a relationship between sort of your dad's personality and legacy and your work?
I do. I think, one thing that was very important in our house was education. And that was something that was important to both mom and dad. I mean, my dad, absolutely brilliant. The amount of information he had in his head at all times. And his sort of mantra, he would never use that term, but that's the one that's coming to mind right now, was which everyone in the family knows and is on his headstone, is, have you asked a good question today? And when I first sort of took that in at whatever age it was, to me, it was about gathering information, knowledge. Knowledge is power. And the more, probably in the last 10 years and with my dad's death, I've really started to realize that question was so much bigger than knowledge, that question, inherent in it, is listening. You have to be listening in order to ask a good question. It's being open-minded. If I'm going to ask a good question, can I be open to whatever I'm going to hear? Can that good question potentially have an impact on the person I'm asking? Can it spark a moment of insight for them that they might not have come to without the facilitation of a good question, right? And then just that piece of lifelong learning. Like, if you're asking good questions, if you're doing that on a daily basis, you're constantly learning. You're constantly sort of refreshing your view of the world. And I feel like all of that is so important to the work that I do with individuals and families. Because I'm their guide in giving. I'm the one asking these questions to help them see things they may not have seen, or see things in a different way. And so, yeah, I mean, I feel my dad's presence and legacy in the work I do every day.
Is there what you would call a good question that you sort of regularly find yourself asking people that you're working with, or one you've asked recently that maybe is like particular to a certain circumstance, but that you felt like this is connecting?
I think one of my favorite questions to ask people is, what is a meaningful gift that either you've given or you've received? And that is really at the heart of what I do with people, is get them to a place where they're not just writing a check, but they're really giving from their heart. They're giving from their values, and there's a meaning behind that gift. And so I like to get at what that is for them. And that's when you see people light up. That's when the joy of giving comes through. And that's what I hope we can replicate. Can we get all their giving to that level of meaning for them?
Wow. That is a great question, and it's one I'm going to use maybe just in my private life, but I really like that one. So thank you. One of the things that I find in talking to people that hopefully engenders a sense of, confidence and self-appreciation is the sort of the greatest or the most important piece of personal progress that you've made in your lifetime. And I know, in reading a little bit of your bio, you've talked about how you went to like a 2164 training, which is, I would, if people don't know what that is, it's a program that kind of brings consultants and advisors to and individuals to think more deeply about how they're giving and why they're giving and who they are as a person, right? And you've completed one or more of those trainings, and so I assume that you've thought quite deeply on any number of those matters, as just an example. So I'm wondering what you feel like is sort of your greatest progress that you've made.
I appreciate you bringing in 2164, because I do think they're part of my journey on this path for sure. In learning about myself, like I think that is the biggest progress. I've had people coming into this profession ask me, what can I do? And I say therapy. Like, really, if you can get to know yourself, that is so important in being able to do work with others. And it's been therapy. It's been pushing myself to go to a 2164 training a couple different times, and speaking up, really learning to speak up and voice my opinion when it's not always easy. It's reading the self-help books, whether it be Susan Cain's Quiet, which really helped me understand who I am as an introvert, or Elaine Aron's book, The Highly Sensitive Person, which was another huge aha moment in my life. As I better understand who I am and how I operate in the world, it allows me to be a better guide for the people that I work with, because I can understand how I can best support them, how I can best hold their hand on this journey, and also maybe have these sensitivities allow me to sort of see them in a way that they might not see themselves, and be able to ask those questions or point out, have you ever thought of it this way? And And that's a lifelong journey for myself, right? Is learning about who I am, and certainly each individual, each family that I interact with, there's a new takeaway for myself and who I am through that interaction. And I just think that can be so it has been so powerful for me, and I think it can be powerful for others the more they dive into learning about themselves.
I'm asking this big question of you because it seems like you're the kind of person who thinks this way, at least occasionally, is when you think about the culmination of your professional work, like where you're headed, you know, where the boat is pointing, what do you hope that you are building as your own sort of professional legacy? What do you hope people would say about you at the end of your career?
I don't, you know, I don't know that I would have answered it this way, but I think this conversation has kind of gotten us to this place of Deborah helped me see things differently. Deborah helped me see possibilities that I didn't know were there. Deborah helped me celebrate the meaningful moments of life, to find these moments that are more than just the milestone birthdays or the weddings or the anniversaries, but that they're there in the everyday life. And I have access to those. And that, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say that philanthropy is more than money. Philanthropy goes much further than any money we can give. It's something that can be a part of our daily life in the way we act and show our love of humankind.
Well, you have certainly given me a lot to think about and to talk to you about more after this conversation.
Good.
Is there anything more you would say if you were, I've been prompting people with this question of what would their first 3 sentences of their obituary be, which I view as a beautiful gift of a question. I know it can sound dark, but is there, you've said quite a lot on the professional end. Is there something you would say about yourself personally or in your personal life that you would deeply want to be remembered by?
You know, I think some of those statements I just made would sort of apply even to my personal life. You know, I'd love to be known for being a loyal friend and a caring family member. And I think that, you know, relationships are what life is about. And we have them in our personal lives. We have them in our professional lives. And as much as we can continue to steward those relationships, that really allows us to create our own lives and our own paths. And clearly just reflecting back on my father, you know, and that clip you played earlier. I mean, here was this man that he got in the car with, you know, hitchhiked to high school with, and there was something there to that relationship, right? There was something there that really set my dad on a path. And I think if we all can be, you know, aware of that in our life, you know, who knows what can happen if we're open to it.
And the last thing I'll ask, and I wish we could spend more time together. We will, but apart from here, is if you had the opportunity to talk to your dad again today, like you and I, we get off of this and then your dad just like walks in the room where you are. What do you think you'd want to tell him?
I love him. I was listening. And I'm really proud he was my dad. I got really lucky with him.
Thank you for sharing him with me.
Thank you for asking. Thank you.